She sat beside me, and rested her hand on my leg. In that moment, everything changed. The day had begun like any other, quiet and unremarkable. I was sitting by the window, a book resting loosely in my hands, sunlight spilling across the pages and painting golden patterns on the wooden floor. The distant hum of neighborhood life filtered in, the soft murmur of voices, the occasional bark of a dog, the faint rattle of a bicycle on the pavement. Everything felt ordinary, calm, and safe, the kind of day where nothing unexpected was supposed to happen. And then she arrived. My neighbor's sister, her presence was impossible to miss. She walked in with that effortless grace that seemed to belong more to the poetry of a memory than the casual reality of a living room. She was in her early 40s, poised, confident, yet there was something quietly vulnerable about her, a depth behind her eyes that drew attention without demanding it. Her hair fell naturally around her shoulders, catching the sunlight in soft, warm highlights. Even her slow, deliberate movements seemed imbued with a subtle rhythm, as though the world had learned to pause for her. "Hello," she said, her voice smooth, warm, and steady. It wasn't loud, but it carried an easy authority that made me aware of my own heartbeat. I looked up, suddenly aware that I had been holding my breath. We exchanged small talk at first. The kind that feels almost meaningless on the surface, comments about the weather, a brief discussion about a mutual acquaintance, the mundane topics that somehow become charged when someone enters your world unexpectedly. But as she moved closer, settling into the chair beside me, I felt a subtle shift. Her hand brushed against the armrest, so close that I was acutely aware of the heat radiating from her skin. I noticed little things, how she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, how her eyes lingered on mine for a fraction longer than necessary, how the faint scent of her perfume mixed with the warmth of sunlight in the room. The air felt heavier, charged, though nothing had actually changed. I felt curious, alert, slightly unnerved, but in the most deliciously human way. The age difference was obvious, yet unspoken. Her calm, measured presence contrasted sharply with my youthful restlessness. I found myself observing her gestures, noting the way her fingers traced the edge of the chair, the way she leaned slightly forward when speaking, the quiet patience in her gaze. I realized I was drawn not just to her appearance but to the weight of her experience, the quiet confidence that came from having lived and seen more than I ever had. It was a quiet afternoon, ordinary in every sense, and yet it felt extraordinary. The world outside continued its soft murmur, but inside, the space between us seemed to thrum with possibility. That's when she rested her hand briefly on the edge of my knee, a gesture so casual it could have been innocent, but it wasn't. It lingered, a light warmth that spread slowly and deliberately, and I became aware of something I hadn't expected, the beginning of a connection that neither of us could yet name, but both of us could feel. In that moment, I realized that ordinary days could end with extraordinary encounters, if you were paying attention. The room felt smaller somehow, as if the space between us had suddenly become charged, alive. We were sitting side by side now, and the sunlight had shifted, spilling golden warmth over the edge of the sofa and illuminating her face. She laughed softly at something I said, a quiet, melodic sound that made my chest tighten in an unfamiliar way. The easy rhythm of conversation continued, but beneath it, there was a subtle tension, a delicate thread that neither of us dared pull too hard. She shifted slightly, adjusting her posture, and as she did, her hand brushed my leg. At first, I thought it accidental, a fleeting contact that barely registered. But then, her palm settled there for a moment longer than necessary, warm and soft, yet firm enough to be felt clearly. I became acutely aware of the subtle pressure, the gentle weight of her presence, and I realized it wasn't just a touch, it was an invitation, unspoken and open-ended. My heart picked up a rhythm I couldn't control. I could feel the faint pulse of blood beneath her fingers, the warmth spreading slowly from my knee up into my thigh. A thrill ran through me, not just from the touch itself, but from the confidence and ease with which she allowed it. There was no rush, no urgency, just a quiet, steady awareness that we were both noticing the same thing, thinking the same unspoken thought. She didn't speak, and I didn't either. Our eyes met, lingering in the shared silence, and in that gaze, there was an understanding, a recognition of curiosity, hesitation, and attraction all at once. I felt an odd mixture of nervousness and calm, like standing on the edge of something thrilling and unknown. Her fingers moved slightly, brushing a different spot on my leg, not in a flirtatious or overtly intimate way, but in a manner that suggested comfort, trust, and subtle attention. The air in the room seemed heavier, infused with quiet possibility. I noticed the way her hair fell softly over her shoulder, the gentle curve of her wrist, the faint scent of her perfume that clung to her even after she shifted. Every small detail registered in my mind, each one heightening the sensation of closeness, each one making me aware of the age difference, not in years, but in experience, calm, and quiet confidence. She moved with a certainty that I didn't yet have, and yet, her touch invited me to lean into it, to feel the warmth without overthinking it. Even the sounds of the outside world seemed to fade. The distant chatter of neighbors, the hum of passing cars, the subtle creak of the floor, all became a soft backdrop for the moment unfolding on the sofa. My thoughts were clear and simple: awareness of her hand, awareness of how easily my attention had been captured by something so fleeting yet so profound. It was brief, but it lingered. The subtle contact, the warmth of her skin against mine, and the quiet understanding in her eyes planted a seed of connection. It was more than curiosity, more than attraction, it was a shared, unspoken acknowledgement that something was beginning, something that neither of us had expected but both of us could feel. In that single lingering touch, I realized that intimacy didn't always need words, that moments could speak louder than sentences, and that the quiet warmth of a hand resting on your leg could shift the ordinary into something unforgettable. After that first lingering touch, something in the room shifted. The silence between sentences was no longer empty, it was charged with a subtle awareness. We continued talking, at first about ordinary things, the weather, mutual acquaintances, a book I had recently started, but I noticed that each word now carried more weight than it should have. Every glance, every pause, seemed to echo beneath the surface of our conversation, hinting at unspoken thoughts neither of us yet dared to voice. She smiled at a story I told, the kind of soft, knowing smile that reaches the eyes and warms the chest. Her gaze lingered just a little longer than casual politeness demanded. I caught myself watching the way her fingers curved around her teacup, the subtle tension in her knuckles as she gestured while speaking. Even the quiet way she leaned slightly forward to emphasize a point made my heart respond in ways I couldn't quite articulate. Small touches occurred naturally, almost imperceptibly. When she reached for her cup, her fingertips brushed mine ever so slightly. A shiver ran through me, not from the touch itself, which was brief and innocent, but from the awareness of proximity and the intimacy of shared space. I realized I was hyper-aware of everything about her, the warmth of her hand, the soft cadence of her voice, the faint scent of her perfume lingering in the air. Each small detail anchored me to the present, yet pulled me toward a deeper, unspoken connection. We talked about books, music, and memories, things that seemed mundane on the surface but carried undercurrents of personal significance. She spoke of past travels and experiences with a calm authority, yet occasionally her voice softened when she mentioned moments of vulnerability. I noticed the slight furrow in her brow when she recalled difficult decisions, the gentle pause before she laughed at something that once embarrassed her. In those moments, I felt I was seeing a side of her that few others ever did, a mix of confidence and quiet vulnerability that was magnetic, almost hypnotic. As our conversation meandered, I found myself opening up more than usual. Normally, I'd hesitate to share personal thoughts, but with her, words flowed freely. She listened with intent, nodding subtly, her eyes never leaving mine, her presence steady yet inviting. I felt a rare kind of comfort in her company, as if the world outside had temporarily vanished and only the two of us existed in a space defined by warmth, curiosity, and trust. Even when our hands weren't touching, the memory of her earlier contact lingered. I became aware of the weight of her gaze, the subtle shifts in her posture as she leaned closer to listen, the way her knee occasionally brushed against mine. Each of these small, almost accidental gestures reinforced a growing awareness of connection, something deeper than simple attraction, something that spoke to emotional resonance and mutual understanding. By the end of the conversation, I felt a quiet, almost overwhelming sense of closeness. It wasn't just the physical proximity or the lingering warmth of her touch, it was the shared recognition of something unspoken, a fragile but undeniable bond forming between us. In that ordinary afternoon filled with small talk, I realized that the simplest conversations could carry the heaviest emotional weight, and that intimacy, real, human, grounding intimacy, could emerge from the smallest gestures, glances, and words. The days following that afternoon seemed to hum with a quiet intensity. I found myself replaying her presence in my mind, the subtle warmth of her hand on my leg, the soft way she had leaned closer when talking, the light in her eyes that hinted at something more than casual interest. Yet beneath that fascination, a tension began to build within me, a mixture of admiration, curiosity, and something I hesitated to name. I caught myself second-guessing every thought. Was I reading too much into her gestures? Was it natural friendliness, or something deeper? The age difference between us, though unspoken, weighed on me like an invisible hand pressing against my chest. She was older, more experienced, and confident in ways I hadn't yet learned. I admired that about her, but it also stirred a quiet anxiety, a fear of crossing invisible boundaries, of misinterpreting signals that could never be properly explained. When she visited again, I was hyper-aware of my own movements. I noticed how she adjusted the folds of her dress as she sat down, how her hair occasionally brushed her cheek, and the faint, comforting scent she carried with her. Every small detail seemed amplified, magnified by the self-consciousness that now colored my perception. I became acutely aware of the subtle spaces between us, the narrow gap of the chair, the fleeting moments when our knees brushed, and it felt like the entire room was charged with unspoken possibility. She, too, seemed aware. There were moments when her gaze would linger a fraction longer than necessary, her lips curling into a soft, knowing smile that left me unsettled and elated at the same time. She asked questions, laughed lightly at my jokes, and reached out in small, considerate ways, adjusting a pillow, leaning closer to hear a quiet word. Each gesture felt intentional, yet innocent, making it impossible for me to discern whether I was imagining more than what existed, or whether she was intentionally testing the boundaries of our connection. The conflict inside me grew. I wanted to reach for her hand again, to feel that warmth, that quiet reassurance, but I hesitated. Part of me feared judgment, part of me feared vulnerability, and part of me feared the consequences of misreading the moment. Every glance, every brush of her fingers, was both an invitation and a challenge, a delicate dance between desire and restraint. I realized I was learning more about myself than about her in these moments. I was discovering patience, awareness, and the ability to experience intimacy without demanding it, to savor the tension and read the signals carefully rather than act impulsively. Every hesitant smile, every slight pause in conversation, became a silent language between us, a code that neither of us spoke aloud but both of us understood. By the end of the visit, the room seemed heavier with quiet expectation. Neither of us had crossed the line, yet the closeness we shared felt undeniable. I left with a mixture of exhilaration and frustration, my thoughts racing but my actions restrained. The internal conflict, the hesitation, and the silent longing had transformed an ordinary afternoon into a landscape of emotional complexity. I realized that sometimes, the most profound connections are forged not through grand gestures, but through subtle, careful attention to the spaces between words, the pauses in movement, and the unsaid acknowledgement of desire. In that delicate tension, I understood that the story between us was just beginning, and that every careful, hesitant step mattered. It was late afternoon when she arrived that day, the sunlight softer, more forgiving, spilling through the windows and casting long, warm shadows across the room. I was sitting at the table, pretending to be absorbed in a book, though my mind had already wandered through every memory of her visit before. When she walked in, she carried the same effortless grace, but there was something different in her expression today, a quiet weight, a shadow behind her eyes that made her seem both strong and fragile at once. We sat side by side as usual, the familiar space between us suddenly charged with a new intensity. She started speaking softly, hesitating, then continuing in a tone that was more personal than I had ever heard from her. She recounted a memory from her past, a moment of regret, a choice she had questioned, a loss she had quietly carried. Her voice wavered just slightly, enough to make me lean closer without even realizing it, drawn by the sincerity, by the vulnerability she was sharing. I noticed the small gestures that accompanied her words, the way her hands trembled ever so slightly when she folded them in her lap, the way her eyes flicked to mine as though seeking reassurance, the faint exhale that escaped her lips when she paused to gather her thoughts. Every subtle movement amplified the weight of her story, and I felt a deep desire to offer comfort, to be a steady presence, even if only silently. Without thinking, I reached out, placing my hand lightly over hers. Her skin was warm and soft, the subtle pressure of her hand against mine creating a ripple of awareness that traveled up my arm. There was no rush, no force, just a steady, grounding connection. She didn't pull away, instead, her fingers relaxed slightly beneath mine, and I felt a quiet acceptance that was both comforting and electrifying. In that single, simple gesture, a bond formed that was deeper than words could express, a trust, a recognition, a shared intimacy born from vulnerability. The room around us faded. The distant sounds of the neighborhood, the hum of a passing car, the faint barking of a dog, became inconsequential. All that mattered was the shared silence, the gentle warmth of contact, the knowledge that we were holding a space together where honesty and emotion could exist without judgment. I realized that vulnerability could be a powerful form of closeness, far more meaningful than any casual touch or fleeting smile. I watched her as she spoke, the way her eyes glistened when she remembered painful moments, the way her lips pressed together when words failed her. I was struck by the courage it took for her to reveal herself in this way, and I felt an almost protective instinct swell inside me, not possessive, but tender, sincere, and deeply human. By the time she finished, neither of us spoke immediately. The quiet between us was full, charged with emotion, yet comfortable. Her hand remained under mine, warm and real, a subtle but profound anchor. In that moment, I understood something essential: true intimacy is forged in trust, in the courage to be vulnerable, and in the unspoken acknowledgement that another person can hold your quietest truths without judgment. That day, our connection deepened, not through words or grand gestures, but through shared presence, gentle touch, and the honesty that quietly reshaped the space between us. I realized that this delicate, patient intimacy, was the heart of what was growing between us. The late afternoon had drifted into early evening, and the room was bathed in a soft, amber glow from the low sun outside. Shadows stretched lazily across the floor, blending with the quiet warmth that seemed to settle naturally between us. We were sitting side by side on the sofa, closer than before, the air around us thick with unspoken words. Conversation had slowed, becoming sparse, replaced by glances, subtle movements, and a profound awareness of each other's presence. She shifted slightly, adjusting the folds of her dress, and for a brief moment, our knees brushed again. This time, neither of us flinched. The contact was fleeting, but the warmth of her skin against mine sparked a quiet electricity that left both of us aware of the tension building in the space between us. I felt my pulse quicken, but the moment was not frantic, it was deliberate, gentle, and alive with possibility. Her eyes found mine, holding my gaze longer than necessary, and a small, knowing smile tugged at the corners of her lips. It wasn't flirtation in the obvious sense, but a subtle acknowledgement, a silent conversation that required no words. In that glance, I recognized the same curiosity and restraint that I felt myself harboring. We were both aware of the unspoken desire, yet neither of us rushed to define it. There was power in that quiet, in the patient recognition of the bond growing between us. Her hand moved slightly, brushing a stray lock of hair from her face, and it lingered near mine. The gesture was almost unconscious, yet it carried meaning. My fingers twitched, itching to reach for hers, to close the space, but I resisted, aware that anticipation could be as potent as contact. Even in stillness, the connection was undeniable. The warmth of her presence, the subtle rise and fall of her breathing, the gentle sway of her posture, all of it spoke louder than any declaration could. We shared small moments of touch, brief, accidental grazes as we reached for objects, the slight shift of her hand on the sofa arm brushing against mine. Each contact was electric, intimate in its restraint, creating a dialogue of sensation and presence rather than words. The distance between us shrank not through force but through patience, a gradual collapse of barriers that allowed tension to breathe and grow. Even silence became meaningful. We watched each other, aware of every shift, every blink, every tiny gesture that revealed the inner workings of our thoughts. I felt a deep, almost meditative connection, the kind that exists when two people acknowledge a desire without needing to name it, when the mind and body communicate in perfect, unhurried harmony. By the end of the evening, the world outside seemed distant, inconsequential. The soft fading light, the quiet room, and the shared warmth of proximity wrapped around us like a cocoon. I realized that desire doesn't always demand bold action. Sometimes, it whispers, lingers, and grows in silence, in the shared understanding that both hearts are aware and patient. In that gentle acknowledgement, we found something profound, a connection that could speak volumes without a single word. That night, I left the room with the lingering heat of her presence in my mind, a quiet, tantalizing reminder that our story was entering a deeper, more intimate phase, where emotions were more felt than spoken, and every gesture mattered. The evening had fully settled in, and the room was bathed in a soft, golden glow from the last traces of sunlight slipping through the curtains. The ordinary sounds of the neighborhood, distant voices, the faint hum of passing cars, the occasional bark of a dog, seemed far away, muted, as though the world had momentarily softened to accommodate the quiet intimacy between us. We were sitting side by side, not speaking, yet fully aware of each other's presence, and for the first time, there was no need for hesitation or restraint. She shifted slightly closer, just enough that the warmth of her arm brushed against mine. Her hand lingered near mine, as if waiting, offering, and silently acknowledging the journey we had shared over the past days. I didn't move, but I didn't pull away either. I simply allowed the moment to settle, feeling the steady rhythm of her breath and the gentle warmth of her skin against mine. It was a closeness that was both thrilling and grounding, a quiet affirmation of the bond we had been building, moment by delicate moment. Her eyes met mine, and I saw a softness there that mirrored my own emotions, contentment, trust, and a quiet happiness that didn't need words to exist. She reached out, placing her hand lightly on my shoulder in a gesture that was both tender and intentional. It wasn't a dramatic display of passion, but a warm, steady contact that conveyed all the care, understanding, and affection that had quietly grown between us. The weight of that touch resonated deeply, filling the space between us with unspoken reassurance and shared satisfaction. I felt an unexpected sense of peace, a release from the nervous anticipation that had colored our earlier encounters. The lingering touches, the quiet glances, the subtle proximity, all of it had led to this moment of emotional clarity. I realized that connection is often less about grand gestures and more about the patience to feel, observe, and cherish each other's presence. The trust we had nurtured through vulnerability, hesitation, and subtle intimacy had culminated in a warmth that was impossible to ignore. We didn't need to speak, the silence was full and comforting. I felt a quiet gratitude for the way she had allowed herself to be vulnerable, for the way she had acknowledged desire without rushing it, and for the way she had shared space with me so naturally, so generously. Every glance, every brush of her fingers against mine, every small shift in posture had become part of a delicate, unspoken language, a language that told me she cared, that she trusted me, that our connection was real and lasting. As she finally rose to leave, her hand lingered briefly on my arm, a soft, lingering farewell that conveyed more than words ever could. I watched her walk away, the warm light highlighting her graceful form, and I felt a slow, contented smile spread across my face. The room seemed to hum with the memory of her presence, a quiet reminder of the depth of what had begun between us. In that moment, I understood something essential: true intimacy is found in patience, attention, and shared vulnerability. We had reached a place of emotional closeness and warmth, where every gesture mattered and every glance carried weight. And as the door closed gently behind her, I felt certain that this was not an ending, but a beginning, the start of a connection that was steady, respectful, and profoundly heartfelt. If you enjoyed this slow burn romance and the story of unexpected connection, don't forget to like this video, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell so you never miss a heartfelt story. Share your thoughts in the comments. Have you ever experienced a moment that changed everything in silence?